last we spoke of Darth Krayt and his ultimate failure despite his power. He failed because he did not truly understand the nature of the tides of fate. He became as much a tool of the dark side as the dark side was a tool of his. Today, we will speak of one who understood what Krayt did not, that sometimes people have to choose for themselves, and that true power comes not from compelling obedience, but from convincing others to willingly do what you desire. This person went by many names throughout her life, so many that her true name has perhaps been lost to the mists of time. Accessing file on Kreia the Wise. Processing. Much of Kreia's early life is shrouded in mystery. Though her true name was unknown, there is some evidence to suggest she may have been born as Eren Kai, a Jedi Knight of some note. What we do know for sure is that she was talented in the Force, and she acted as a Jedi historian, obtaining the rank of Master and training many students. She was known for her unusual way of approaching teaching, often taking a more philosophical and open-minded approach to the Force. Her greatest student would become known as Revan. During Kreia's time at the Order, the Mandalorians attacked the Republic. They struck along multiple fronts at once, and the Republic military simply could not hold back the tide. As they often would during times of crisis, the Jedi collapsed into debate. They did nothing while Republic worlds burned, openly wondering if the wars was theirs to fight while innocent people died by the millions. This did not sit well with some within the Order. One Jedi in particular could not simply sit in inaction. This Jedi was Revan, and in his desperation for answers he would turn back to the master he had learned the most from, Kreia. From her, Revan would find the courage to do what had to be done, and he would lead his followers to war on the Republic's behalf against the will of the Council. For this, the Jedi would banish Kreia from the Order, claiming her teachings were flawed if they could lead her followers so far astray. After being banished, Kreia accompanied Revan to war. While the exact nature of her involvement is unknown, she is sure to have seen her friends die, to have seen powerful Jedi swatted out of the air as their landing craft came down, to have seen wielders of the Force overcome by blaster fire. For all their power, the Jedi were as much at the whims of fate as any other trooper, and this left them exposed to the dark nature of war. Revan's tactics became more and more brutal, more hardened, as he sought more desperate measures to end the conflict. He stopped caring about things like civilian casualties and instead focused himself only on victory. His followers, too, began to follow a similar path. At some point, Kreia was believed killed during the fighting, but she would survive, and though Revan's campaign would leave her behind, she would follow his footsteps into the Outer Rim. Eventually, the Mandalorians were beaten back into the skies above Malachor. There, Revan would slay Mandalore in single combat and activate a device known as the Mass Shadow Generator, a gravity generator of epic proportions. It crushed all the Mandalorian and Republic forces caught too close to the planet in its embrace and ended the war in one stroke. Revan would go on to continue his own path, and in his wake, Kreia would arrive at Malachor. The mass destruction and painful deaths there had created a wound in the Force, and she would follow the echoes of this wound back to the ravaged planet. There, she would find the remains of the Atreus Academy. This ruin was an ancient training ground for the Sith, stretching back to before the old Sith Empire. contained a trove of knowledge and ancient Sith relics, and was the source of the dark side energies permeating Malachor. Kreia would be corrupted by the dark side as she walked upon the surface of the planet, and she would become Darth Treya, Lord of the Treyas Academy. The manuscript she found there would teach her that the powerful sorcery of the ancient pure-blood Sith had pierced the veil of reality and found the perceived aimless and random nature of life to be a lie. The truth was that there was no freedom, choice, understanding. It was an illusion, and the Force was what covered the falsehood. The ancient Sith believed Force sensitives were slaves of the Force, and that all beings were forced to live in a seemingly chaotic and destructive world only to support the illusion of choice. The Force controlled all. There, Darth Treya would also learn of a deeper evil dwelling far out in the unknown regions, an evil we will discuss much later. But Kreia realized that Revan had never fallen to the dark side. He had chosen it to give himself the power to fight something greater. Her shame and guilt that perhaps her teachings had led Revan to the dark side turned into anger. She had been right. Revan had always had the greater good at heart, and the Jedi, fools that they were, had banished her for nothing. Her hatred drove her deeper into the corruption of the dark side, and she would move to establish an order of Sith assassins out of the remnants of Revan's empire. She would seek out more wounds in the Force, and this would lead her to find new pupils in Darth Sion and Darth Nihilus. Together, these three would form the Sith Triumvirate. Darth Treya would teach Sion how to use his pain to let the dark side sustain his broken body, and she would teach Nihilus how to soothe the gaping hole his Force wound had caused by draining the life force of those around him. Together, they began to wage a shadow war against the Jedi, striking from the shadows and killing them one by one. Their new abilities would eventually come to consume both Sion and Nihilus. Sion would become only an avatar of anger against the Jedi, caring for nothing but their destruction. And Nihilus would forget all except his hunger. When it became clear they had no more to learn from her, they turned on Darth Treya, casting her down, leaving her for dead, and seizing the reins of power for themselves. But she would survive. She would take up her old name of Kreia, and she would find herself free of the corrupting influence of the dark side, but with the same feelings of anger and betrayal. For the first time in her life, Kreia could see clearly. First, she had been a slave to the Jedi, and during that time she had seen in war how even the strongest Jedi Masters could be snuffed out if the winds of fate shifted against them. Then, she had been a slave to the dark side, becoming corrupted on Malachor, becoming chained to her emotions and driven into a war against the Jedi which would prove to be her ultimate undoing. Only when she had been utterly cast down and stripped of everything could she see clearly. She was a slave to neither the Jedi or the Sith, but to destiny itself. She had never really had a choice in her actions. Despite her deep philosophical searchings, she had never had the awareness to truly choose. And it was in that moment she decided she would be a slave no longer. The tides of fate flow stronger around some than others, and it is those few whose choices truly have import, whose choices truly have the ability to shape the galaxy. She saw this in the example of Revan. Despite being his master, of teaching him all she knew, Kreia could still not affect destiny the way Revan could. His choices carried weight that hers never could achieve. But that did not mean Revan, or others like him, could not be manipulated. Like all beings, Revan was bound by physical laws, which meant intrinsically the board could be stacked to influence his decisions. Make a man hungry, and he will be inclined to eat. Make him angry, and he will be inclined to lash out. Only the individual is responsible for their actions, but the world can be changed to push their choices one way or the other. Kreia finally understood the nature of true power. Real power is not forcing others to your will, it is shaping the world so that they choose it willingly. Elsewhere in the galaxy, the Jedi began to disappear. Nihilus and Scion's shadow war began to swing in their favor. During this time, Kreia would begin to search for the person she needed to enact her true plans. She would finally find such a figure in Mitra Surik. Mitra was Revan's second in command and his close friend during the Mandalorian Wars. She alone had remained uncorrupted by the war and had returned to the Jedi Council to face judgment. As they had done with Kreia, the Jedi had exiled Surik for her actions. Mitra had been at Malachor. It was her order, in fact, that directly activated the mass shadow generator. To be present during such an act left the same mark on Mitra that had left on Malachor itself. She became an echo in the Force, a wound torn open by the pain and suffering around her. She could also form unusually strong Force bonds, and it was the combination of these two factors which finally fully crystallized Kreia's plans. She would join with Surik and train her. She would manipulate Surik into forming an incredibly tight Force bond with her, and Kreia would begin to teach Mitra the power of choice. Kreia would manipulate Mitra into destroying both Scion and Nihilus, and into seeking out the remaining Jedi, bringing them together in the ruins of the Jedi Enclave on Dantooine. There, Kreia would betray Surik and kill the remains of the Jedi Order. With both the Sith and Jedi all but destroyed, Kreia would return to the Treyas Academy on Malachor. Surik would follow her, and there the two would face each other. Kreia attempted to get Mitra to strike her down in anger. The nature of their Force bond, the damage already done to Mitra, and the damage already done to the Force itself at Malachor, meant that such an act would create another echo, one which would travel forever, essentially killing the Force and freeing the galaxy from its domination. The two would fight, and Kreia would become mortally wounded in the confrontation. But as she lay dying, instead of striking Kreia down, Mitra stayed her hand. She forgave her for her betrayal, and in that moment, all of Kreia's plans were undone. And yet the old woman went to the Force in peace. Why? What is there to be learned from the tale of the enigmatic Kreia? She, too, would fail in her goals, just as Krayt, but she would come closer than he to achieving her ends. This is because Kreia understood the Force. It pervades all. It binds us, and we are trapped within its flow. The only real way to affect the current is to find a way to influence those around which the current swirls strongest. Choices can have real consequences. They spill out around us like ripples in a pool, or perhaps more like echoes in a cave. This can seem contradictory to the idea of the Force controlling fate until you understand that not everyone's choice carries the same weight within the Force. Kreia saw the Force as a slave taskmaster. It is in this that her and I disagree. The Force is as intrinsic to the universe as gravity itself, and like gravity, it is neutral. It has an effect, real and measurable on each of our journeys through time, like gravity has on hyperspace calculations. But I am no more a slave to the Force than I am a slave to gravity. I am bound by it, and yet I can manipulate it, use it to my own ends. Where Kreia's chief insight lay was in her understanding of the tides of fate. Her multiple ascensions and falls from power on both extremes of the Force showed her that the only way to control the flow is to understand how to control those who it swirls around the most, of convincing those people to freely choose your way. The truest way to manipulate the Force is to learn to manipulate life around you. I have said the Force is a mirror, and this is true. If the Force is a mirror, we must look to changing what causes the reflection, to have any hope of changing what we see. To become a master of fate, you must understand sometimes you have to submit to it, that sometimes it is others who have the real power to shift the current. Kreia died at peace because she knew that she had stacked the Pazic deck as best she could. She had done everything she could, fought as hard as she could fight. She recognized that Mitra's destiny was larger than her own. All she could do was try to convince Surik to her side. In the end, she did not fail so much as Mitra decided not to play Kreia's game. And to Kreia, that was good enough. You too must learn how to recognize these individuals, and you must learn how to bend them to your will without breaking them. How to convince them to make a choice which will carry weight in the reflection of the Force and which will shift the tides of destiny. Meditate on this, and return when you have absorbed the lesson of Kreia. When you understand her insights, I will tell you of another who perfected them and actually achieved his goals. Until then, may the Force break your chains.